Charlemagne stands out as one of those rare figures who truly deserves the title of great because he was a man who seemed larger than life, not only in his achievements on the battlefield, but also in the vision he carried for his people and for Europe itself. He was the kind of ruler who seemed born to play a role that most others could only dream of, half conqueror, half saintly king, with a reputation that spread from the forests of Saxony to the hills of Lombardy. It is said that if you looked at his reign as if it were a game, every box would be checked. Campaigns stretching across decades, victories piling up as if the man were guided by divine providence, and a reputation for both power and piety that made him the archetype of a Christian monarch. When he took the throne, the West was fragmented, a shadow of the empire that once dominated the known world. Yet through endless campaigning, negotiation, and administration, Charlemagne managed to bind vast territories together under his banner. He was called the Father of Europe for good reason. And while much of his success rested on the shoulders of the warriors who followed him into battle, it was his own will and charisma that gave coherence to the chaos. He ruled not as a temporary conqueror, but as a figure aiming to craft permanence, to forge something that would endure after him, and for nearly half a century he held it together. But while Charlemagne built in the West, in the East the Byzantines carried the torch of the Roman Empire, battered yet still gleaming. They had suffered through the rise of Islam and faced calamities that threatened to break them, yet Constantinople stood, a jewel glittering on the Bosporus, and there arose within its walls a figure no less fascinating than Charlemagne himself, Irene of Athens, who against all odds carved her place into history as empress and regent. Clever enough to navigate the deadly currents of palace intrigue, bold enough to command armies and dictate policy, she reclaimed lands lost, restored trade, and though she faced bitter opposition, she wielded authority with remarkable determination. Her reign is remembered as one both brilliant and brutal, for she was capable of cultural revival, yet also capable of merciless acts against her own blood. Two figures, one in the West and one in the East, each embodying power and ambition. And history brings them close enough for the imagination to ask, what if? What if the paths of Charlemagne and Irene had not only crossed but merged? What if in the year 800, or even earlier, a marriage united the Frankish West with the Byzantine East? What would it mean for Europe, for Rome, for Christendom, for the centuries that followed? It is tempting to dismiss such a union as fantasy, yet history shows us it nearly happened. In reality, Irene did consider such a match. Advisors dissuaded her, politics turned against her, and the fragile balance of power tipped away. But imagine instead that she accepted. Imagine instead that Charlemagne and Irene stood side by side, the crowns of two realms merged into one vision. The Pope in Rome now faced with a reality he could not manipulate, and the endless rivalries of East and West set aside in favor of something new, something greater, something resembling the revival of the Roman Empire itself. Before we leap too far, let us recall that the seeds of such a possibility were planted even earlier. Long before crowns and coronations, there had been talk of binding dynasties together, of daughters promised and alliances forged, and though they did not blossom in our world, in another they might have, and a single decision by a king or an empress might have changed the trajectory of Europe. Consider the state of affairs in the late 7th century, the Lombards subdued by Charlemagne, the Saxons resisting but gradually broken, the Abbasids rising in the east, Byzantium still rich but weary of threats, both empires stretched, both constantly balancing war and diplomacy, both aware that survival meant partnership as much as conquest. What better answer to the ceaseless instability than a marriage uniting East and West, binding the Franks and Byzantines not as rivals but as kin? So let us open this alternate chapter. Let us imagine Charlemagne not as the Western emperor crowned in defiance of Byzantium, but as the partner of Irene, their union shocking rivals, dazzling subjects, and setting Europe on a path unknown to us. For history is nothing if not fragile, And here, in this fragile point, a new destiny could have been written, one in which the dream of Rome reborn was not a slogan or a coronation, but a living reality, with two rulers ambitious enough to attempt it, ruthless enough to enforce it, and perhaps wise enough to sustain it.
The union of Charlemagne and Irene is more than a marriage in this alternate history. It is a statement to the world, a proclamation that East and West no longer walk separate paths, but instead share one destiny. The ceremonies in Constantinople would echo with chants not of division, but of unity. And from Aachen to the Aegean, whispers would rise that Rome itself had returned, not as fragments, but as a whole, reborn in flesh and crown. In this version of history, Irene recognizes the fragile grip she holds on power and the constant dangers that circle her throne. She sees the Frankish king not as a threat to her legitimacy, but as the partner who could secure it. Her advisors warn her that the proud Byzantine elite will never tolerate a Frankish husband seated beside her, yet she also knows that without allies, she stands vulnerable. The sword of palace intrigue always aimed at her back. So she accepts, and with that acceptance, the fate of Europe bends. Charlemagne is no fool either, his empire vast but brittle. His borders constantly under siege by Saxons in the north, by Moors in the south, by pagans across the rivers. He knows that raw conquest cannot sustain itself forever, that legitimacy, trade, and alliances matter as much as steel. And so, when the offer of union reaches him, when he imagines himself not only master of the Franks, but also kin to the ancient Roman throne, he understands the opportunity. He imagines a legacy beyond the wars of today. He imagines his grandchildren ruling not just one empire, but two halves of a reunited Rome. The consequences unfold swiftly. First in Italy, where the friction between Frankish and Byzantine claims had always brewed tension. Now that tension dissolves into partnership. Venice and Ravenna, once pawns between East and West, now find themselves tied into a grander system. Trade routes open, disputes quiet. The peninsula becomes less a borderland and more a bridge between worlds. Next, in the papacy, where Leo, the Pope, had once crowned Charlemagne in defiance of Byzantium, here that crown is no longer a challenge, but a confirmation. For how could Rome reject a union that embodies the faith of both realms? Leo finds himself diminished, unable to play kingmaker, yet he also sees the strength in aligning with rulers who now command not just armies, but the symbolism of Rome itself. The papal power begins to shift, less independent, more subordinate to imperial authority, a subtle change that echoes far into the future. The Byzantines, meanwhile, breathe easier, for Irene no longer stands alone against rebellious nobles. With Frankish support, she can stabilize her court. Those who once plotted in the shadows must think twice knowing the armies of the West stand ready. In return, the Byzantine fleets and engineers lend their strength to Charlemagne. The Franks, who had long struggled with naval power, now find themselves learning from centuries of Eastern mastery. Together, they form a synergy that neither realm could have achieved alone. But history is never peaceful for long. The enemies at the gates remain. In the east, the Abbasid Caliphate presses against Byzantine borders. In the north, the Bulgars grow restless under their khans. In the far north, the first stirrings of Viking raids begin to shake coastal communities. Yet now, when these threats emerge, they face not two empires divided, but a partnership. Trade caravans cross from the Rhine to Constantinople with less obstruction. Scholars and priests debate theology not as rivals, but as colleagues. And soldiers march with banners representing both halves of Christendom. The cultural exchange alone reshapes Europe. Latin and Greek texts circulate more freely. Medical knowledge, architecture, and philosophy flow across borders. Monasteries in Gaul copy works once confined to Byzantine libraries, while scholars in Constantinople study the legal reforms of the Carolingians. What once were parallel tracks of civilization begin to merge, and the sense that Rome has returned grows ever stronger. Of course, opposition does not vanish. Byzantine nobles grumble that a barbarian Frank sits beside their empress. Frankish lords whisper that their king has tangled himself in foreign intrigues, but the marriage produces children, heirs who carry the blood of both dynasties, and blood speaks louder than discontent. For every faction that resists, another bends, calculating that survival now depends on loyalty to this new imperial union. Imagine for a moment the sight in Constantinople, the hippodrome filled not only with Greeks, but also with Franks. Processions where Charlemagne and Irene appear together, the purple of Byzantium mingling with the iron discipline of the Frankish Guard. The people may resist at first, but as bread flows, as markets thrive, as borders hold, they adapt. And soon they no longer see the union as scandalous, but as inevitable, as destiny. Meanwhile, Charlemagne adapts as well. His rough Western court exposed to the refinement of Byzantine ceremony, Aachen becomes less a barbarian stronghold and more a reflection of Roman grandeur. Mosaics, arches, and scholars imported from the East transform his capital. In turn, his own style of rule, more pragmatic, less ceremonial, begins to influence Byzantine governance, creating a strange blend of Roman formality and Frankish practicality, an empire that looks both backward to Rome and forward to something new. The echoes of this alliance ripple outward. Smaller kingdoms that once played east against west now find themselves surrounded by unity. The Lombards no longer plot, the Avars feel the pressure of united armies, and even distant rulers in Cordoba and Baghdad take note, for the West no longer appears fractured but formidable. And the dream of Christendom, capable of challenging the great powers of the world, becomes real. This is not to say harmony rules, for Irene is ambitious and protective of her authority. Charlemagne is pragmatic, yet proud, and their partnership often sparks friction, but friction does not destroy it. Instead, it forces compromise, balance, and from that balance emerges stability rare in the medieval world, a stability that could shift the entire trajectory of Europe. And in this alternate path, by the end of the 8th century, the idea of Rome restored is not a fading echo, but a living truth, carried by two rulers who dared to join what history had long kept apart.
Years pass, and the marriage of Charlemagne and Irene grows from a shocking alliance into an established reality. What began as a bold gamble gradually transforms into the backbone of stability across Europe. Their children stand as living proof that two worlds once divided can be fused into one lineage, heirs of both the Frankish West and the Roman East. And as these heirs grow, the nobles on both sides realize that whether they approve or not, the future belongs to them. The Frankish Empire, which once stretched precariously across vast territories, now enjoys an anchor in the east. Constantinople becomes not a rival, but a partner, and the Byzantine realm, which once teetered on the edge of collapse, now enjoys the muscle of Frankish armies standing behind it. The union strengthens both realms in ways no one could have foreseen, and across Europe, rulers whisper nervously of what this means for them, for who can defy an empire that calls itself Rome Reborn? The Pope in Rome finds his influence weakened, yet not erased, for he still holds spiritual sway over millions, yet his political power wanes. He can no longer crown and uncrown kings at will. He must bow to the reality that Charlemagne and Irene embody imperial authority without his blessing. And while resentment brews within the papacy, there is little it can do but adapt, for open defiance would mean facing both Eastern and Western swords together. Thus the papal state grows quieter, less daring, more cautious, and in the long term this shift may prevent many of the conflicts that in our world defined the relationship between church and empire. Meanwhile, the world beyond Christendom does not rest. The Abbasid Caliphate to the east remains strong, its caliphs ambitious and its armies vast, yet even they regard this new imperial union with caution. Once they saw Byzantium as weakened prey and the Franks as distant barbarians. Now they see a united force stretching from the Atlantic to the Bosporus, and though raids and conflicts continue, the prospect of a full invasion becomes less tempting. Instead, trade becomes more prominent, caravans traveling more securely under agreements made between empires, goods flowing from Baghdad to Aachen, silks and spices traded for timber and iron, creating a network of prosperity that might never have existed otherwise. In the north, the threat of the Bulgars continues, fierce warriors pressing against the borders of Byzantium. Yet in this world, their advances are met not by an isolated emperor, but by a coalition. Frankish heavy cavalry joining Byzantine legions to repel them, and in one legendary campaign, a combined army drives deep into Bulgar territory, burning forts and forcing a treaty that secures the Balkans for decades. Such victories spread the legend of Charlemagne and Irene, and the people begin to speak of them not just as rulers, but as saviors, chosen by Providence to guard Christendom itself. And then there are the Norsemen, the Vikings, whose first raids are beginning to crash against the shores of Britain and Francia. In our history, these raids would swell into centuries of devastation, but here, their expansion meets an empire more prepared. For Byzantine naval expertise and shipbuilding techniques flow westward, Frankish coasts defended with improved fleets, and when the dragon prows appear on the horizon, they encounter stronger resistance. Raids still occur, but less freely, less devastating, and though the Northmen remain a menace, they never achieve the same unchecked dominance. The tide of history already shifted by the Union. Culturally, the blending of East and West begins to produce wonders. Scholars gather in courts where Latin and Greek mingle. Theological disputes, once threatening a schism, now debated under shared councils. Architecture blossoms, with churches rising that combine the domes of Byzantium with the sturdy grandeur of Carolingian design. Mosaics glitter in Aachen, while Frankish stonework strengthens walls in Constantinople. This cultural fusion creates a style that will later inspire generations, a Rome reborn, not an imitation, but an innovation. For Charlemagne himself, the partnership is both gift and challenge. He must learn to navigate the intricate webs of Byzantine ceremony and politics, worlds away from the simpler structures of the Frankish court. Yet he adapts, as always, pragmatic and tireless. While Irene, for her part, must balance her authority with that of her formidable husband. She yields when necessary, yet holds firm where it matters. And though their marriage is tested by ambition and pride, it does not collapse. For both know the cost of failure. Both know that their enemies wait for any crack to exploit, and so they endure, rulers bound by necessity as much as by oath. By the closing years of the 8th century, the empire they have forged stands as the dominant power in Europe, rivals humbled, borders secured, trade routes thriving, and the memory of Rome long faded now seems alive once more. Yet history is never a straight path, and new storms gather on the horizon, for succession always looms, and the question of who inherits this colossal union may prove more dangerous than any foreign enemy. The children of Charlemagne and Irene grow, their bloodline destined to rule, yet nobles whisper, factions form, and the balance of East and West once again wavers. And so as the 9th century dawns, Europe holds its breath. For in this alternate timeline, the fate of Christendom depends not only on armies or crowns, but on whether this fragile fusion of cultures can survive beyond the lives of the two titanic figures who made it possible. Charlemagne and Irene, the emperor and empress of a reborn Rome.
The final years of Charlemagne and Irene stand as a turning point in this alternate history. For while their reign forged a unity unseen since the height of Rome, the true test arrives with the question of succession. Empires can be won on battlefields and secured with marriages, but the real measure of endurance is whether they can pass peacefully from one generation to the next. And in this fragile world of medieval Europe, that challenge is immense. The children of Charlemagne and Irene carry the legacy of two dynasties within their veins, heirs who symbolize both Frankish vigor and Byzantine refinement. Yet this very strength also fuels jealousy. For nobles on both sides fear being overshadowed. Some Frankish lords whisper that too much Greek influence threatens their traditions, while Byzantine senators grumble that barbarian customs sully the purple throne. Factions emerge, loyalties blur, and the seeds of discord are sown, even as the empire shines at its height. Charlemagne himself ages, his once unstoppable energy slowing, though his mind remains sharp, and Irene too begins to feel the weight of years. Yet together they continue to rule with determination, refusing to yield ground to rivals. They tour their dominions, from the forests of Saxony to the marble halls of Constantinople, reminding their people that the empire is not an illusion, but a reality held firm by their presence. And as they do so, the image of Rome reborn becomes more than rhetoric. It becomes memory, an experience lived by the people who walk its streets and fight its battles. The external world, too, adjusts. The Bulgars, wary of testing the might of united East and West, keep their distance after costly defeats. The Abbadids focus inward, consolidating their power rather than seeking open confrontation. The Vikings still sail, but with greater caution, their raids blunted by stronger defenses. And though threats never vanish, they no longer seem overwhelming. The balance of power leans toward Christendom, a reversal of the fears that once haunted both Franks and Byzantines. Yet destiny rarely allows peace for long, for in the year of tragedy, the empire suffers a blow. The Bulgars ambush a campaign in the Balkans. The young heirs of Charlemagne and Irene march beside their armies, and in the chaos, one son falls, his life cut short before he can inherit. Grief shatters both rulers. The empress, known for her steely resolve, and the king, famed for his iron will, stand broken. Yet even in sorrow they cling to their purpose, knowing that weakness would invite collapse. They bury their child with honor, and in their grief the people see not distant rulers, but human parents, bound by the same suffering as any family, and loyalty deepens. Still the shadow of succession looms, for Charlemagne's health declines. Pneumonia strikes him down as the cold winter grips his lands, and the mighty emperor who had once towered above Europe finally yields to mortality. Irene, older but unbowed, now stands alone as guardian of their legacy. And for a time it seems the fragile union may unravel without the presence of its western pillar. But fate grants one final twist. Their surviving heir, a young son raised in the traditions of both Aachen and Constantinople, steps forward. Young yet prepared, his claim undeniable, his bloodline proof that Rome lives. The nobles who once whispered hesitation find themselves compelled to accept, for to reject him is to invite chaos. And so he is crowned not as king of the Franks or emperor of the Byzantines alone, but as ruler of both, heir to the vision his parents forged, his name echoing across Europe as the first sovereign of a truly united Christendom. Though challenges remain and rebellions stir, the foundation is solid, built by decades of cooperation, and the empire does not collapse into dust, but endures, reshaped and redefined by the will of two rulers who dared to imagine what others thought impossible. The legacy of Charlemagne and Irene in this alternate history is profound. The papacy never rises to wield unchecked political power, for imperial authority overshadows it. The East-West schism that in our world fractured Christianity may never fully bloom, for shared counsels and compromise become tradition. The Viking Age burns less brightly, its fires contained by stronger defenses. And the balance of power between Christendom and the Islamic world shifts, with united Rome standing as a formidable counterweight. Centuries of conflict take new forms, perhaps even new outcomes, for when East and West are brothers rather than rivals, the story of Europe unfolds on a different stage. More than politics or war, the greatest change is in culture. The blending of Latin and Greek traditions creates a renaissance centuries earlier. Knowledge preserved in Byzantine libraries flows freely into Frankish lands. Monasteries thrive as centers of learning. Architecture evolves into forms breathtaking in scale and beauty. Science and philosophy progress not in isolation, but in union. The Dark Ages lighten, and though hardship remains, the spark of a brighter world ignites sooner than in our history. And so the tale of Charlemagne and Irene in this imagined world does not end with exile or division, but with a vision made flesh. Their union births not only children, but an empire reborn, fragile yet enduring, challenged yet unbroken. And though history as we know it followed another path, here we glimpse the tantalizing possibility of what might have been, a Rome restored not by dreamers, but by rulers bold enough to seize destiny. And through them, Europe itself altered forever.